3 Ukraine-based Russian paramilitary groups say they have crossed into Russia and are now fighting government troops there, posting videos in the Belgorod and Kursk regions.
Now, Ukraine's military denied any involvement in Tuesday's cross-border raid, saying the paramilitary groups were independent organisations of Russian nationals and therefore, in effect, operating at home. We'll head north. The former head of the British Army, Lord Richard Dannatt, joins us. Lord Richard, whatever you want to be called, my friend, thank you for joining us. This is really interesting. We talked a couple of weeks ago about how one goes about, you know, trying to get Putin out, and we talked about how the Russian people are, in effect, they're told what to think in terms of press and media. We talked about the importance of the war, maybe defeat for him. These are Russian nationals going and fighting against. This is the beginning of something quite relevant, do you think, from a military point of view?
Well, it's certainly a dent in Putin's sort of mask of control of the whole country. There are his so-called elections coming up quite shortly. And so these kind of reports, if they are getting into the state media or at least getting out and about on social media, will be damaging to Putin himself, because he would love to give the impression that he controls the whole of Russia and it's all fine and dandy. There is the terrible war going on in Ukraine, but he's getting it sorted. So this is an embarrassment. It's a difficulty. But I think it also points up the reality of the areas of geography that lie between Ukraine and Russia. It's artificial in any part of the world to draw a line and say everyone on one side of it is this and everyone on the other side of it is that. So it does show that there are Ukrainians who are Russian sympathetic living in Ukraine, and there are Ukrainians living who are Russian sympathetic and vice versa on the other side. So it is damaging. I'm sure it's been done, although be it deniably, in cahoots with Kyiv. But the intention is to try and derail Putin's impression of complete control over his country.
And Lord Dannatt, what do we know about the people involved in these paramilitary groups? Where have they come from? How have they become sort of...
How
have they become mobilised, and
yeah.
where have they come from?
Money, backing, logistics. Where does that come from?
Well, it's a very good question. I think one has to say that it's inconceivable that if they were Russians living in those Russian border areas, that they somehow managed to invent for themselves some tanks and some armoured fighting vehicles and some artillery and missiles and ammunition, which they can suddenly explode on the villages in the area that they live. Now, I think one has to be grown up about it and realistic and realise that these groups, they're determined people in their own right to put forward their own political agendas, but they've been supplied and encouraged by Ukraine, even though Kyiv may choose for its own reasons to deny that. But the overall objective of what they want to do, to destabilize the Putin regime, is very much in Kyiv's interests. I think one has to deduce, without probably having at this stage much factual evidence, that the support that's enabled them to do what they've done has come from the Ukrainians.
We spoke to Kira Ruddick, a well-known Ukrainian MP who's been on this station many times, and I was trying to, and I'd love to know from a military point of view, we can look at the horror that is going on in the Middle East, the humanitarian crisis. We know what happened in October. We all have very strong views on that. Is there a danger, and I don't know how best to put it, is there a danger that what's going on in Ukraine, and I talk about war fatigue, because for me, the war in Ukraine is absolutely central to all of us. And if he succeeds in Ukraine, and anybody tells me, I'll argue with them, he puts a foot in Europe, the NATO, the rest is that it is a European war, which is why I actively say we need to keep supporting Ukraine 1,000%, because that essentially is the best way to get rid of Putin. I genuinely believe that. Do you think there's a danger, Lord Dannatt, that in terms of looking at what's going on in the Middle East, people are like, oh, God, more money. What are we going to do? We're struggling ourselves. Is that a fear amongst the military chiefs, do you think?
Well, I think it's a fear that can be reasonably shared by anyone, but you're absolutely right in what you just said. What's really critical for us in particular in the United Kingdom, and by extension those of us in Western Europe, is to make sure that Russia fails in Ukraine. And it's absolutely vital that we go on supporting. And that's why it's really important that Joe Biden batters away somehow in the United States to unlock that $60 billion package that Ukraine desperately needs. One's told today that 300 million has been found to be sent to Ukraine in terms of extra artillery and air defense missiles, well, that's something. But 300 million compared to 60 billion is, I'm afraid, a drop in the bucket. You perfectly reasonably link across to what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And yes, the world could think, oh gosh, here's another major campaign. But I come back to what I said just now. What's really important to us is to ensure that Russia does not succeed in Ukraine. That really matters to us Europeans. As far as the Middle East is concerned, it's a disaster that's going on there. Pressure, I believe, must be exerted on Israel to change their tactics and to allow more humanitarian aid to get in to prevent a mass starvation, which would be, frankly, a catastrophe on a world scale. But from our point of view, our focus should remain on supporting Ukraine. That affects us and our security in the UK and in Europe.
Lord Dannatt, you spoke there about what Biden had potentially pledged to Ukraine, but what if Donald Trump gets in at the next election over there? He has allegedly said that he wouldn't send a penny to Ukraine. What could that mean for Ukraine in their fight against Russia and Putin?
Well, if he was to get in and if he was to do what he actually says, it would certainly in the short term be a disaster for Ukraine. It would then fall very much on the European countries to decide what was going to be our policy. Were we going to tighten our belts even more to try and make up the deficit in financial and military aid terms to Ukraine, that the withdrawal of American support? Or are we going to sit Zelensky down and say, look, we've helped you as much as you can. Your major ally, the United States, has now left you. I think you've got no alternative but to start to talk to Russia. Now, none of us want to go there, because if that happens and Russia and Putin retains control of any part of Ukraine, then frankly, Putin and Russia have won. They've achieved at least part of their objective. And that is not good, certainly for Ukraine, but it's not good for security of the rest of Western Europe. I mean, why else, against the current set of circumstances, with Sweden and Finland at this moment in their history have decided to join NATO? This is a real threat. And I think the only thing I would say in regard to Donald Trump, he talks an awful lot. He doesn't necessarily always do exactly what he says he's going to do. I mean, think back to that big, beautiful wall he was going to build to stop immigrants coming into the southern United States. Well, he hasn't really done it. He's talked a lot about a lot of things. Does he necessarily do them? Trump worries me. I don't want to see him as president again, because I think the sort of things we're talking about are dangerous. But go back to what I was saying a moment or two ago, keep saying it. Ukraine really matters to us in Europe. And if he pulls out, then actually Europe has got to do much, much more.
I would respectfully suggest that they're an election year and Donald Trump probably sees himself and finds it useful to say, I could stop the war by speaking to Putin. I think the reality will be very different. But I absolutely agree with you about Ukraine. We need to keep people's focus on that, however difficult. Thank you so much indeed. We really appreciate you being on today.
Thank you, Lord Richard Dannatt there.